Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Katie Poser. I am with the NOAA Central Library, and I will be your technical host today in the background. Now, the NOAA Central Library is very excited to be partnering with the NOAA Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander Employee Resource Group, and I'm excited to hand it over to Virlin Francisco to to introduce our speaker today, talking on NOAA's Maritime Heritage Mission, the Museum of the Sea. Take it away, Virlin.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the NOAA Library and the NHPI ERG. The goal of the speaker series was to highlight NOAA employees and especially to highlight their contributions to the NOAA mission in the Pacific region. So I think with today's speaker, we have definitely accomplished that. And today's speaker is Dr. Hans von Tilburg. He is a Maritime Heritage Coordinator with NOAA's Office of National Marine Sanctuaries Maritime Heritage Program in the Pacific. And what I found interesting is with all of that work and with all of the projects that he's doing, Dr. Van Tilburg has published numerous articles and several books. And he currently serves as the co-chair on the Asian Employee Resource Group. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Van Tilburg. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Virlin. Thank you both. It's a pleasure to be with you today and to get to talk about our maritime heritage, maritime archaeology, and what NOAA is doing in this field and what we need to do. And some of you may be familiar, but maybe some aren't. So I'm happy to do a general introduction and talk about this mission, a broad spectrum of Americans engaged in the stewardship of our national maritime heritage. Really, from a certain perspective, it's just another type of marine resource that we have responsibilities for. But it engages our curiosity in history and archaeology. And I've got to tell you, some sites we see underwater, like this site on the slide, this massive wreck site of an iron-hulled sailing ship, we see things like this underwater and just scratch our heads and need to figure the story out behind it, the mystery of these resources on the seafloor. But to begin, what is maritime archaeology anyway? It's very simple. It's actually just, the understanding, the interpretation of our human past events, past human behaviors and lifestyles by looking at the physical remnants or artifacts from the past and sites that help us decipher that past. So sometimes in recent periods, we use historical documents to help flesh out that story, but for the distant past, we often don't have that written historical documentation. We look at the artifacts. So the maritime side of it is simply, we're a marine resource management agency. And so we look at underwater sites and coastal sites that are partially or fully submerged. The field, the academic field of maritime archaeology is fairly new and goes back only to maybe the 1960s, when folks like Dr. George Bass, who worked in Pennsylvania and then worked at Texas A&M for so long, began to look at sites in the Mediterranean, Bronze Age sites, in a systematic fashion. Before that, they had talked with, Greek sponge fishermen who had found artifacts and dragged them up in nets, but nobody was looking at the sites on the bottom of the sea floor systematically with the archaeological approach to understand those sites better. It goes back to the 1960s. And it focuses on the retrieval of that archaeological and historical information. Yes, there were, excavations and recovery of artifacts in the past, but we don't necessarily need to be recovering things all the time in order to understand the information that a submerged site has. And it's quite a multidisciplinary field, engaging anthropology, history, ocean engineering in many ways, biological and chemical deterioration and chemistry. And it's all of those things to retrieve information from these resources underwater, but it's not just going out and finding something and taking it back to a museum. It's not Indiana Jones all the time. Sometimes in the public venue, we have to address that a little bit. It's not just recovering things and running away from flying arrows and things like that. Not really. So that's what archaeology is underwater. There are distinct phases to projects, any projects that we do. If you know, it usually begins with archival research to understand the type of resources or the survey area, the search area to find any significant underwater properties or sites. Sometimes those are old charts. Sometimes captains sketched wrecks right onto those charts, which is a pretty good hint of where things might be. We also use, you know, a series of remote sensing tools in discovery of a site underwater. Here you can see a sketch, a graphic of what a hull-mounted multi-beam sonar system does. It kind of sweeps the sea floor with a fan of sound and receives those acoustic signals back to interpret the shape of the sea floor. And we can tell sometimes when things have straight lines or angles or right corners, something might be artificial rather than natural on the bottom. We can do assessment of those sites. Not everything is going to be important to look at, of course, and there are a lot of things underwater, but many things are. And so either using remote sensing tools or robots or divers on the bottom, we can assess and characterize a submerged wreck site if it's a shipwreck or an aircraft. And sometimes, although not always, it's warranted, it's appropriate to recover materials from the seafloor. And I will say that's can be a complex process because these things have soaked up the chlorides in the marine environment and deteriorated to a certain extent, and exposure to an oxygen-rich environment, again, especially if they've been covered by sediments, requires a conservation and stabilization process. And so excavation is complicated. Then we do, you know, we do outreach. We tell the American public about what we do. We're responsible for that, sharing this information of what our public resources. And we are a public agency archaeologists working for NOAA. And in a certain cases, there are preservation and protection actions that are warranted. So any work we do, we try to disseminate the protection message that these are special resources, non-renewable resources, unlike a lot of species and biological things underwater. And we have a responsibility to care for those in ways for future generations. Why we do this is not simply because we're interested, though. It's actually a federal mandate, particularly for federal agencies and offices like ours. In 1966, the National Historic Preservation Act was formed, has sections like 106 and 110 that basically say federal offices need to inventory and protect the significant historic properties under their jurisdictions. And this is what that engagement often looks like, where we meet with the public and we determine, you know, what types of properties are significant, cultural resources that need this type of attention and preservation. So we're driven by this national mandate. And we have responsibilities to comply with NHPA 1966. We're not just the sole arbiters of what is important. There are, you know, standards and criteria established for what is an historic property, what is significant underwater. So it's not simply that I like, you know, World War II assets or someone else likes, you know, the Revolutionary War shipwrecks. Yes, that can be true, but there are criteria and standards established by NHPA, which tell us, you know, what are the types of historic properties that might be considered. Coastal fortifications, pillboxes from, you know, war events, shipwrecks, of course, submerged aircraft often can be historic, the remnants of piers or landings. Even in this lower picture, the bait cups, the whaonga in American Samoa, which were used to grind bait and to hold bait along the shoreline, which can be partially submerged, can be an historic property. So there's a wide range of historic properties, in other words. We call these historic properties. They're known by many names: cultural resources. Internationally, you'd probably hear underwater cultural heritage quite a bit. That's kind of the terminology that's used these days, UCH. It's not always shipwrecks. Here's a fine example from the Pacific. I think this is from Palau, taken by a colleague of mine, Dr. Bill Jeffrey, a shoreline, near shore tidal stone fish trap, which is, often submerged, often emergent during tidal flows. But these are, not only are they archaeological sites, these are living cultural heritage and resource sites important for people today. And these types of fish traps go back hundreds of years. So those are important considerations for understanding UCH. But the other big reason, besides NHPA and besides our own interest, is, of course, the National Marine Sanctuary Act of 1972. We have, 15 or more now marine sanctuary sites within NOAA that we manage, and also national marine monuments, and you see them here. And so this is where our direct responsibility, our mandate, sees most of our effort within the boundaries of our marine monuments and our sanctuary sites, many on the East Coast, a series on the West Coast, and out here in the Pacific, Papahanaumokuakea, Hawaiian Islands National Humpback Whales Sanctuary, and American Samoa, National Marine Sanctuary, American Samoa. So these kind of have our first focus on this type of management. So you get a feeling for the scale and scope of this resource. I'll just show you graphically what the inventory looks like for the Hawaiian Islands, where I'm stationed. The database that we manage has over 2,400 entries, and about 700 of those are confirmed green triangle eyes-on submerged properties, shipwrecks, aircraft, etc. Are all those significant under NHPA? Many are, some aren't. We apply the criteria, but this is the scope and scale of the resource. Worldwide, there are maybe 3 million or more underwater sites, it's been estimated. There's quite a bit of history underwater, in other words. There are the threats to these types of resources that we deal with, and we're often faced with impacts to be considered from fishing and trawling. That's a particularly large one that can be devastating to a submerged historic shipwreck site. But any kind of bottom contact, even research, can have impacts to disturb the sediment, reintroduce oxygen, move artifacts around, disrupt the integrity of the site, and a whole host of things like anchors from vessels, discharges, intentional looting from diving visits sometimes happens, nearshore development, and climate change is a big one. All of the archaeological sites, coastal archaeological sites, many of which can tell us about past climate regimes, are now being impacted by coastal changes and coastal impacts from climate change. That's a big management consideration for us. Sometimes, though, our own resources can pose their own threats to the immediate environment. And so that's also a consideration. Often this is in the form of, internal storage and fuel oils on shipwrecks, tankers, or unexploded ordnance loaded onto ships, carried by ships, Navy ships particularly, or aircraft. And you can see here, these are considered rusting time bombs on the global scale. And in the image on the far right, you can see the concentration here of wrecks, many of them from World War II, many of them are tankers in the Western Pacific, of this potential for, the oil that's still inside these wrecks. This is probably the premier example we point to often, the USS Arizona, right here in Pearl Harbor. Not only is it a historic shipwreck, clearly, not only is it a tomb for more than 1,200 sailors killed during the December 7th attack, but it is also a source of oil inside the bunkers deep inside this ship. And you can probably make out the sheen on the water of some of that oil still trickling up. So there are all types of plans, potential threats, and potential values as well, values for these historic sites, these heritage sites that we investigate. We employ a range of technologies to do our work, really ranging from everything between slates and pencils and underwater transect tapes and measuring tapes you see us using on the left, to remotely operated vehicles of various sizes, ROVs for inspection of sites, and remote sensing equipment like side scan sonar and magnetometers to find those sites underwater. The central image here is the multi-beam sonar I mentioned before in hull-mounted mode. Sometimes we've had the opportunity to use manned submersibles. This is a Hurl Pisces submersible in Hawaii that we've used for archaeological missions. And diving technology, of course. Usually in the past, it's been open circuit diving, which is tank on your back, blow your bubbles. When you're low on air, come back to the surface. We're now using closed circuit rebreather diving technologies, allowing us to stay under longer and to go deeper underwater to do our work. What's really exciting, what's really changed what we do and the way we do it in the recent years is our own ocean exploration office, NOAA's Ocean Exploration, the vessel Okeanos Explorer, and our ability to broadcast real time from the deep ocean as we do an archaeological assessment of a new wreck site. You can see in the lower left here, the ROV system, the Deep Discoverer ROV being lifted over the side. This mobile camera system with manipulators and thrusters is actually paired or mated to this second ROV called Sirios, which is kind of the downweight you see here on the deck. So Sirios hangs down from the ship and stabilizes that long cable to the bottom. And then D2 does the close-up inspection. This allows us to broadcast signals directly from the bottom of the ocean to the ship, up to the satellite, and directly into classrooms and for the public on the web. And they can listen to us scientists who are, making requests to the ROV pilots to turn left, turn right, zoom in, and talk about the analysis of the site in real time as we do it. It's very exciting, and people have found it very engaging. And I've really enjoyed my experiences with OE, ocean exploration, when we've gotten to do these missions. This is an example of D2 looking at the front of a World War I era submarine right here off the coast of Oahu. There are the torpedo tubes at the bow of the S-19, and we're doing an inspection of the site itself. Very exciting stuff. We had the chance to look at some wrecks off of Wake Island. This is a World War II wreck in the deep ocean. And this is an image from D2. Deep down on the bottom, you can see the deck gun of the Amakasu Maru, which has kind of fallen over off of the cabin here. And here's a clue as to what happened when this ship sunk during the Battle of Wake Island. Behind the deck gun, you might see this little box. This is the ammunition box for the deck gun, and there are 3 missing. So we know nothing about what happened on this vessel during the battle, but we do know now that they manned this gun and probably fired off a few rounds before the ship sunk. So the archaeological site fills in a bit of the history for us. So that's fascinating technology, but we still do things old school when it's warranted, when it's appropriate. And this is my friend Tane Casserly, another maritime archaeologist for NOAA. We're doing tow boarding, visual scanning of shallow reef areas for wreck sites. The water's clear enough that this will work. And we simply put someone on a tow board, pull them behind a vessel. There are protocols to do this very safely that have been developed over time by our colleagues in fisheries and sanctuaries. One of those techniques is here you see this long yellow line that trails behind Tane. I'll tell you, you feel a little bit like bait when you're being towed like this behind a boat looking for wrecks. And so what we do is tie a small white rag to the end of this line. And sharks that might be interested in what's being towed under the water usually home in on the end of that line, looking at the white rag, rather than us. So that gives us an opportunity to come to the surface, signal the boat to come back, and be aware that there's a shark in the water following our diver. So that's diving technology. And I just want to give you a rough idea of how deep we can go when we do these projects. Here's the sport diving range in the very shallows. With tech diving and rebreathers, we're down to, several hundred feet, but it's really the ROVs, the manned submersibles and the ROVs that go down to the abyssal plain. And it's only very special vehicles that can go as deep as the bottom of the trenches. So even with our rebreathers and diving technology, we're still looking at the very shallow edges of the oceans. So just an example of a few places, a few of our sanctuaries that focus on shipwrecks. The Monitor National Marine Sanctuary on the East Coast was formed to protect the Civil War wreck of the USS Monitor, which fought a famous battle at Hampton Roads. That's deteriorated over time, as you can see, from 1862 to 2000. It's inverted, and its revolutionary turret was underneath the wreck. That turret and the guns and the engine as well have been recovered in our museum now in Virginia. So that's a very important site for us. That was our first sanctuary site, actually. In the Florida Keys, we have an extensive maritime heritage trail, a number of wreck sites that have been interpreted for the public. And we put out products and diver slates and maps that help with their recreational dives and doing it in a manner that's responsible and low impact to the resource, that provides assistance to the recreational diving industry in Florida. So that's something that our sanctuary site is engaged in there. In Thunder Bay, we have a shipwreck site on the Great Lakes that's focused on the many wrecks at Thunder Bay, the many 19th century wrecks, doing the same sort of thing, putting moorings out to assist the public with access and interpreting those sites for the public, for the recreational dive industry, and to dive them in appropriate ways that don't impact the resource. Out here in the Pacific, the monument, Papahanaumokuakea, very exposed monument, very open ocean conditions. So the wreck sites we look at there are usually the heavier materials. The wood is all gone, but the steel and the iron, like these anchors or steel-hulled vessels, remain and constitute the majority of the site for us to assess. We're of course interested in big pieces of ships and hulls, but also the small little bits that sometimes we do recover and conserve to tell us stories, to fill in the historical details about a past event, like the sinking of historic whaling vessels in 1822, the bottles they had on board, the copper sheathing that that protected the hull, the musket balls that they carried for various reasons on the ship. One of our newest sites is Mallows Bay on the Potomac on the East Coast, which is actually a place where, over 100 wooden vessels that were built in the World War I period found their ultimate resting place and were, kind of pushed into a backwater after their service. And so here, the wooden hulls are still there, this brackish river, and they've become kind of archaeological and biological islands and sites unto themselves. That's one of our newest sites we're very excited about. Like I mentioned to our organizers earlier, we've done work up on Alaska's North Slope. This is what it looks like when we're doing survey with remote sensing tools, looking for wreck sites. And this is what a portion of those wooden hulls from those whaling vessels in the 1870s looks like when it's washing up on the beach. This is an area, for those of you who know, that's being impacted by climate change. The lack of coastal sea ice means the shorelines are eroding very quickly, and that means the artifacts associated with these coastal wrecks when they were trapped by sea ice in the past are being impacted by climate change in a big way. I want to mention that, that's our work from our agency in the United States, but this field, of course, is much bigger than just the United States. There's a lot of work going on in the UK. They're very focused on their heritage and their maritime heritage. Of course, we all know Britannia ruled the waves for a number of years, right? As they used to say about the empire. There's been, major work in the Netherlands, and Australia is very focused on their maritime heritage. Their history is tied to that transport and the ships arriving in Australia. And the Asia Pacific as well is very focused and has been for a long time. And so we're also engaged often in being a participant and taking part in international initiatives and meetings and conferences, and in this particular one, the Asia Pacific Regional Conference, this is something that has been scholarly and organized with a voluntary committee and initially started in 2011 in Manila, has been held in several places. We hosted in 2014 in Honolulu, and our next meeting will be in November in South Korea. So these topics, the nature of underwater cultural heritage, the protection of it in the international setting, the meaning of UNESCO's 2001 Convention on the Protection of the Underwater Cultural Heritage and its implementation are all being discussed at venues like this, and we're a part of that. We as a country did not sign that convention in 2001, and neither did the UK. There were some issues about jurisdiction and sovereignty that we had, but I will say this, that 2001 convention, that UNESCO convention, was important because it standardized a set of practices called the Annex, a set of rules that we have adopted as our best practices, guidance for interventions that have to do with underwater cultural heritage. And many other federal agencies have adopted those as well, Coast Guard, Park Service, etc. And internationally, that annex is important. So even though we didn't sign the convention, we've been involved in the annex and the rules. And I wanted to show you this as well, because when I was beginning my interest in this field and going back to school after having been a carpenter for about 12 years, my education focused on Western maritime history, and global history, or certainly Asian history, was kind of an amendment in the context of maritime archaeology. But I mentioned for the West, for us, we look back at George Bass and the Bronze Age projects in the Mediterranean from the 60s. Take a look at what Sri Lanka was doing in 1964. They had already formed the National Department of Maritime Archaeology. Or Thailand, 1974, the Underwater Archaeology Division, et cetera, et cetera. And so throughout the Asia Pacific, maritime archaeology as a field goes way back and often doesn't have as much consideration from that perspective among some of the Western initiatives. Our portion of our sanctuary office, our Maritime Heritage Program, really was initiated in 2002. I mentioned that it was, 1972, that was the National Marine Sanctuary Act that gave the Secretary of Commerce the ability to protect areas that were special for a number of reasons, including archaeological, cultural, and historical values. And that's important. But it really wasn't implemented. We really didn't take up the Maritime Archaeology Initiative until 2002, when we added a small Maritime Heritage Program. And that is what NOAA has today. And that is what we have in the United States today federally, is our program within Sanctuaries and the National Park Service's Submerged Resources Center. We're probably the two main federal programs for the United States that address maritime archaeology. That's 2002. Sri Lanka, 1964. Interestingly enough, one of the reasons they started there was because Arthur C. Clarke, who was a science fiction author, had an interest in shipwrecks, and they began doing a shipwreck excavation in the 60s in Sri Lanka. That sort of helped them kick it off. So I just wanted to mention the international context a bit to kind of, set what we do nationally in a broader perspective. This is a global field. It's international and national and regional. And for our sanctuary sites, it's local as well. So to return to our national efforts, this is where we spend our time considering, U.S. waters, U.S. jurisdictional waters. In this case, this is an image that shows you the exclusive economic zone and our initiative, for mapping, our national strategy for mapping the ocean within our exclusion zone. And you can see the areas in red that remain unmapped, within that zone, our 200-mile zone. And so we, as the small group of marine archaeologists in Sanctuaries, got to contribute along with our colleagues in OE to making sure that this NOMAC initiative, this national strategy for finishing mapping our oceans, included an understanding of cultural resources and historical values and the potential for finding, important shipwrecks and other types of properties within this mapping initiative. So I think that's really important that we've elevated the level of our understanding of this resource from very minimally engaged, prior to 2002 to, a larger national level within our agency. And that bodes well for the future. So that's the final slide of my presentation, and I'll stop sharing my screen and welcome any questions. And I hope you feel free to ask me anything about what it is we do, the maritime archaeology field, or perhaps, how I got interested in this stuff in the first place. I'd be happy to go into anything at all about this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hans. This was excellent. And I don't see any questions from the audience yet, but I have a question. Which area are you most excited about exploring kind of for the first time in this mapping project?
Oh, well, there are a couple directions that are really important. A lot of this is our own coastline, right? And, we know prior to the last glacial maximum that the sea levels were much, much lower than they are now. And so that means that in paleo times, in the Quaternary, migration along the coasts occurred usually along that coastline. One of the stories is that the Americas were populated by people walking over the land bridge from, the old world across the Bering Strait into Alaska and south. Well, there's, even a better theory than that migration happened along the coast, along the Kelp Highway, exploiting the marine resources along that coast. So the paleo sites and potential submerged habitation sites that are located along that, what is now submerged coastal shelf have fantastic potential. The technology has to catch up to be able to detect sites like that, lithic sites underwater that may be buried under sediment, and the technology is slowly catching up. But that's one of the areas that we emphasized in the NOMAC initiative, is to include consideration of paleo shorelines, where those are, the potential for us being able to research, these ancient migration routes that have a lot to do with how early humanity spread over the globe. That's one of the important topics to address.
That is so fascinating. And since you brought it up, how did you get into this field? You mentioned being a carpenter, but what drew you into drew you into NOAA and drew you into our maritime heritage?
Accidentally, I would say, very accidentally. I was happily engaged as a carpenter in San Francisco, but I had been raised by my father sailing on his 30-foot sloop together with him, when I was a young kid, and I learned to dive at an early age, mainly because of an old show that most people won't remember. It's a black and white show called Sea Hunt, with Lloyd Bridges as Mike Nelson. So I thought that would be a pretty exciting thing to do. And so I was diving and sailing and had that background. I had never heard of maritime archaeology as a field, and I had been, 12 years beyond my undergraduate education and was building houses in the Bay Area. When I saw in an advertisement a flyer for a field school in Lake Superior on maritime archaeology, I thought that sounds crazy. So as a lark for a summertime activity, I joined East Carolina University and went to their summer field school and started investigating wreck sites up there in the academic exploration investigation of those sites. And I caught the history bug. I got fascinated by the maritime history and after that, I went back to school and got a master's and later, an advanced degree, a PhD degree in history on it. But that's what got me back into it. Just, a summertime opportunity for something that sounded very different and exotic. I still have all my tools, so I still do carpentry for fun, not as a job. But that's how I accidentally fell into the maritime archaeology field.
I love that, Hans. I did just hear that they newly discovered a shipwreck in Lake Superior, so I'm I'm intensely interested in that. But we do have some questions from the audience. So first
Sure.
question, thank you, Hans. On the map of shipwrecks and sites around Hawaii, there was a cluster of shipwrecks northwest of Kauai. Why is there a cluster of wrecks in this area?
That is an excellent question. You are right. The distribution of shipwrecks is not random. It reflects, the patterning of hazards, of navigational routes, of, prevailing winds, shallow reefs, etc. It's patterned. But that cluster is RIMPAC. So, our database includes everything underwater, not necessarily historic. We have RIMPAC exercises every couple of years. That's where international navies join to practice, naval maneuvers. And often there will be obsolete vessels that are destined for the scrap heap that are cleaned up and then sunk as target assets during RIMPAC. So they used to be south of Oahu where they were doing that, but now they've taken them to a deep area northwest of Kauai, and that's where they can practice sinking those vessels as part of RIMPAC and sending them to the bottom. So that's what that group is.
I did not expect that answer. That is so fascinating. Thank you. Our next question, what are some up and coming technologies that you're excited to use in the future?
Well, that's a good one. There are some sonar technologies that are being refined to detect small artifacts, lithic artifacts on the sea floor. And that relates to the paleo shoreline investigations and submerged ancient habitat site investigations. That's very interesting. Also, we've seen some new dive technologies that are also kind of diver mounted, head mounted sonar equipment that allow divers to function in very murky environments. It's quite true that shipwrecks often happen in places where it's not very nice to dive at all. And so, it's nice to have clear water, warm water to see beautiful pictures of wrecks, but lots of underwater archaeologists do their work in places where you'll never see pictures like that because visibility conditions are horrible. So that is another one of those technologies that is advancing. And I'll mention this, that probably the most challenging and impressive shipwreck excavation that was ever done was not by any Western country, but was done by China when they found years and years ago a Sung Dynasty 900-year-old shipwreck in the South China Sea filled to the gunnels with porcelain, but in a very terrible, strong current, murky water environment, open ocean environment. They simply drove a steel caisson down around the wreck, closed the bottom, and lifted the entire section of seafloor along with the 900-year-old Sung Dynasty wreck off the seafloor, put it in the museum, and did the excavation in the museum. No one's seen anyone do anything like that before, and no one's done anything like that since. So that's a topic for another talk, at another time. Quite an amazing technology there, but not an easy one for programs to take on.
Thanks so much, Hans. We do have a few more minutes, so I'm going to try and grab a couple questions. Um, how does NHPA get applied to fisheries? Someone is working for nymphs in Gloucester, and they know that the marine sanctuary there protects some wrecks, but there are many more known wrecks and submerged cultural resources that seem to be left out of their NEPA analysis.
Yeah, I think we've got a ways to go there to coordinate and collaborate in our understanding of that. Um, you know, particularly in state waters, but also in federal waters. Activities, federal undertakings, or undertakings that use federal monies, need to do a Section 106 review to review their actions on whether they have the potential for damaging historic properties or not. And so clearly, the wreck sites that are assessed may be historic, and there can be buffer zones that can be established around there, and sites positions can be released. It's not a fact that they always have to be secret if it means that's a way to protect the wrecks from impacts from trawl nets, et cetera, which can be very damaging. But we take the position that, unless we've assessed a site, if there is a new discovery and we're not sure if it's historic or not, we haven't applied the criteria, we assume it might be historic. So we have a ways to go, I think, with what that means, that Section 106 review, which needs to be done for potential impacts to those sites.
Thanks, Hans. I'm going to try and grab two more questions. One, we saw the image of regions that NOAA is planning to map in the near future. Does this include, or will this include, maps from BOEM and other institutions?
Absolutely. We work closely with BOEM, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and in fact, as a federal agency, they fall under the same need to understand the potential historic properties in areas where they're going to lease for offshore development of energy resources. And so we coordinate between agencies and offices on doing those baseline studies to understand where those things are. So, what applies to us as NOAA as a federal office under NHPA applies equally to any federal office.
And last question, what was one of the more memorable sites you've worked on, and what did you take away from that experience?
Well, there are a lot. There are a lot that are quite memorable, but I will say, um, I think well, for a while, we assisted the Park Service in their dives on the USS Arizona. And one of their tasks was, they were given the opportunity to take the cremated remains of Arizona crewmen, survivors, people who survived the attack, had the option of having their remains placed on board the ship. And so there was a ceremony held on the memorial, and that was followed by the Park Service and the Navy and the family bringing the box of remains to the divers. We waited in the water, and then we would swim over and swim those down into the ship and place them with their crewmates from December 7th, 1941. We had a lot of time to think about it when we waited in the water for them to conclude the ceremony. And it was just really one of the most moving experiences of my life to think that these are men who survived December 7th and survived World War II and went on and had full lives and families and careers elsewhere. And they wanted to return to Pearl Harbor and go back inside the ship to join their mates, their shipmates, when they were 18, 19, 20 years old. Um, that's quite moving, what the Park Service and Navy does. Those have almost come to an end because there aren't many left anymore. But that value of these wreck sites as also war graves and tombs is an important one, because this is a shipwreck field often, and it has that aspect to it. That's very moving, and it was quite an experience to be part of that at one time for us.
Thank you so much, Hans. And thank you all for joining us today. This concludes our talk. And as a reminder, we did record this, so if you do need to come back to it at some point or want to share, please find it on the library's YouTube channel. I did put that in the chat earlier, but I can put it in the chat again. But thank you, Hans, so much for sharing about this. Thank you, Verlin, for bringing this series to the NOAA Central Library and letting us help share this presentation. Everyone, please be on the lookout. We will be having more talks in conjunction with the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander ERG. And we, again, thank you, Hans, for speaking to us today.
You're very welcome. My pleasure.
Take care, everyone.